Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Weird Music. This is of course a show where we look at weird and unusual albums in the world that are weird for whatever reason. It's a term we use loosely on this show. Most things are kind of weird in their own weird way, right? Anyway, today we are looking at one of the most iconic albums in the lo-fi genre that's ever been conceived, I feel. It's one that has this incredible following for its really dark, gritty atmosphere and its exploration of harrowing themes such as depression, existence, and death. We are of course looking at the monumental double album, Deathconsciousness by Have a Nice Life. So of course, let's ask ourselves the question, who are Have a Nice Life? Well, Have a Nice Life is an American post-punk band from Connecticut comprising mainly members Dan Barrett and Tim McCougar. And Have a Nice Life have gained somewhat of a cult following on the internet, mostly in part to the ever-growing popularity of that debut album, Deathconsciousness, a phenomenal double album exploring themes of death, depression and existential dread, all recorded on a shoestring budget of just $1,000. And this album is part shoegaze, post-rock, gothic rock, industrial rock, etc., and it sees a fully immersive dive into really heavy and uncomfortable themes. It's a really harrowing record that's so beloved by so many people, and we're going to be diving into every single one of its 13 tracks today. So, Deathconsciousness. This is it's split into two. It's actually split into two different albums. Disc 1 being subtitled "The Plough That Broke the Plains," and then you get Disc 2 titled "The Future." And it's an 85-minute experience with such a fascinatingly dark and harrowing, sort of concept to it all. It's so heavy in terms of its themes and emotions, as well as how the whole thing sounds. It's really peculiar how something so lo-fi can sound so heavy and indulgent, and those who have heard the album probably know exactly what I mean. It's especially when you get those really heavy bass riffs that just plunge you right into the depths of despair. There's something just so wonderfully emotive and cathartic about the whole thing. It's very interesting, something so depressing having such a large following. We'll get into that. For now though, let's just go into track by track. We'll start with, Disc 1, The Plough That Broke the Plains. And this whole album kicks off with the instrumental track, A Quick One, Before the Eternal Worm Devours Connecticut. And this is, quite simply, a brilliant opening for the album. It's an 8-minute lo-fi deluge of ambience, pushed along by this really dark acoustic riff. It's so dreamy, so existential, it feels like your mind wandering off when you just feel cold and empty on the inside. It establishes, though, such a perfect atmosphere this whole album experience, setting the tone for the really dark, darkness that we're going to be uncovering on this album. I have to say as well, I love the ending of this track though. You get these really ghostly lo-fi vocals completely drowned in effects that just sound so mysterious and otherworldly. It's just like a spectre struggling to communicate, and it all just echoes and ebbs, leading us into the second track. And yeah, people who know this album will know what I mean. This is where things really kick off. Track 2, Blood Hail. Blood Hail just starts pounding away. You get this terrific thumping bass line that just deafens you as the guitars screech and whine. And it's so indulgent, so cathartic. It just kicks off with these incredibly phenomenal lyrics. That's very existential. That's embedded in so many of the lyrics on so many of the songs on here. And yeah, it's weird because it's such a relatable existential anguish sung so brilliantly by Barrett, who just cries out in so much pain. And yeah, I've listened to this album so many times, But every time I listen to Blood Hail, I'm just blown away by his vocals every single time. And man, this is only the second track on this album. No, and there's so much more to come as well. Like, it's such a perfect launching off point for after the introduction of the first track. And Blood Hail kind of introduces us to, that sort of like quintessential Have a Nice Life start, where you get really heavy, fuzzy shoegazy bass and fuzzy, noisy guitars and vocals that are so just drowned out in reverb, all colliding into each other. Man, what a phenomenal track this is. Easily a favourite of so many people for obvious reasons, I feel. So, track 3, The Big Gloom. Now, this is easily one of my favourite tracks off this entire album, off both discs here. And, once again, you've got that really chunky bass that's so loud and fuzzy, and those vocals that are just so drowned out in those effects. And, lyrically brilliant as well. Like, I have to say, like, all the lyrics are brilliant on this album. Like, it's amazing how easily and effortlessly he communicates this existential dread. And for me, this one, The Big Gloom, it seems to communicate to me like the disconnect you feel from depression, those times where you really feel like you just don't exist in any way or form anymore. And there's something just so sad about that, but there's something so weirdly comforting in how Barrett expresses that sentiment on the track, Such a peculiar sense of sincerity when he just so sadly sings, "Please, please, please release me." And I have to say as well, though, the drop following the first chorus of "Release Me," where the beat just pounds out so loudly as that fuzzy deluge just builds up and up, is such a brilliant moment. And for me, like, the song, it just gets better and better from there. Like, it's phenomenal. You get a cry out of, "I am trapped, I'm stuck here on the bathroom floor," which, man, I don't know why, but that particular line just gets to me every single time. It's something so cathartic about how he just howls that out in such, just such pain and misery. And, I feel like I should mention that, it gets to me though, because it's a fascinating experience when music communicates those experiences to you. You start feeling it so cathartically that you can't help but just cry out in your own emotions, And I love how, not just the song, but the whole album carries those emotions as you experience the whole thing, And yeah, with The Big Gloom as well, it's got this beautiful fade out at the end, and it just feels so perfect, especially that kind of stuttering you get of the instrumentals that just feel like your heart's struggling to even keep up anymore. For me, when you get sort of thrown into a very depressive episode and things finally start to settle a bit after you've had that, real confusing overload of emotions, it feels like the emotions take so long to just fade out and just settle down. And I feel that's really represented in this particular track, and in the whole album too, though, as well, to be fair. But in particular, I love how it just slowly subsides with The Big Gloom. So, after that, we get into the incredibly atmospheric Hunter, which, for me, I feel like this is one of the darkest tracks on the album, though. It's a track that, lyrically, it seems to be drawing parallels from the death of nature hunted by the titular hunter, expressed from their own perspective as they are caught, wounded, and their lives end purely for the benefit of those who are going to consume them. And man, there's something quite violent about it, to be fair, the prey simply existing, expressing their lack of will to even try, get out of the situation, just simply giving in to the hunter's violence, and, it's simply the way things are, like, this is how it is. And for me, that's something so unsettling and peculiar atmosphere about that, though. And as well, like the track itself, though, that atmosphere is sort of pushed along by these really weird glitchy drums that are at the forefront of so much of it all. And I remember when I first actually listened to Have a Nice Life, it was recommended to me by this chap I met at a party one time. And he recommended the album, I started listening to it, and Hunter was the one that really stood out for me for some reason. And it was there that, that because that's what drew me in. It's what made me want to explore the album even more and explore the band and their music. It's this really weird, dark, foreboding experience. Like, I've got to hand it to them. It's so powerful. And so on to track 5 then. We have Telephony, which is another bass-driven track with this phenomenal riff that just pushes it all along as we're given another dreary existential musing. And Barrett's vocals, once again, they're so ethereal, so ghostly, and they push along conventions of shoegaze to this very peculiar place, to be fair. And as well, like, lyrically, you're pushing along the story of the album there, that disconnect, it dropping you into this very scary place where you just don't feel like yourself anymore. And you find yourself just loathing and hating yourself and, pushing you further and further away from people. It's very scary, but it's a very relatable experience, for those of us who have been there before, been there in the throes of depression and anxiety where you just feel so disconnected from people. Like, it's amazing how well it's communicated on so many of the songs on this album. Very dark, very foreboding, but the cathartic release of that, though, makes it a really phenomenal experience to listen to. And then on track 6, Who Would Leave Their Son Out in the Sun, we get a somewhat peculiar change in terms of the instrumentals and overall structure of the song, with this one being a very peculiar lo-fi acoustic number that sees the guitars and vocals expanded out with effects that turn them into this very ethereal, ghostly experience once again. And it's interesting, it's kind of hard to hear the vocals on this one, but I feel like that's the point, especially when you read them and you see just how broken and despaired this whole thing is. It's so sad at times, just lamenting the fact that nothing's going to help you change the way you feel. And for me, the part that really gets to me, what point is there in pushing on when all you push against is a brick wall? It's a perfect description for that futile feeling one gets when stuck in those really dark, foreboding thoughts. And it's beautiful as well how this track seems to fall apart after this point. The structure, the vocals, it all seems to fade out into this very peculiar ghostly section, sort of further pushing that sense of hopelessness and futility. And it's interesting though, because it has this really peculiar impact on me each time I hear it. It just has this very weird weight to it that when it just all fades away and stuff. And I think it's really interesting for that. It's just so empty and despairing. It's brilliant stuff though. And from there, you get onto track 7, which is another instrumental track, There Is No Food. And this is a very peculiar one that pulses with this very weird electronic beat of notes, before you get these guitars that whine and screech over the top of it. It's very interesting. But in particular, though, you get this wonderful, satisfying drop of bass guitar that's joined by these really weird, indiscernible vocals that are impossible to make out. So all you really have on this one is just the emotion being expressed in how the whole thing is sounding, which, man, it just sounds so despairing and so empty, so numb, so desperate for something, It's an odd one. This one's really odd, I find, though. There's something, I don't want to say uplifting about it, but it does have this sense of sort of rising out from the ashes and gloom towards, like, something, I feel like maybe the light. I don't know how to describe it, but it's got that sort of dark, miserable and empty existential dirge to it all, but it's still sort of reaching up out from it towards something. And I don't know, I find there to be something phenomenally interesting about it for that reason. It's very difficult to put into words, to be fair. And so from here it is we move on to disc 2 of Deathconsciousness, also known as The Future. And I would argue it's here on the album that things get much more frenetic and much more anguished, somehow more despairing and, desperate to feel something amidst the existential crisis. So disc 2, The Future, opens up with the brilliantly named Waiting for Black Metal Records to Come in the Mail. And it kicks off the second half of this album with this really ferocious and bleak dirge that it slowly opens up with these very atmospheric drones that sort of sets the the ambience and the atmosphere for us, before you get this phenomenal pounding of drums that lead the way with this really frenetically loud riff. No, the pacing of this one is phenomenal. It just pushes along so angrily. And I have to say though, this has one of the most satisfying pauses I've ever heard in a song. Like you get in the outro of "No, it's never going to be good enough." He repeats that, and then you get a single pause, followed by one uttering "fuck," and then the heavy, chunky riff just explodes back into the scene again. It's, I don't know, man. There's something so satisfying and indulgent and cathartic in that whole expression. I say as well though, like, because I feel like this is a good example of this very thing. Like, it's an instance where a sporadic use of swearing and vulgar language, it gives it real emphasis when it does occur on the album. It's something I try to explore in my own music that I write. You don't just swear all the time, but you use it, as little as possible. So when it is there, it has this emphasis. It has this, this impact when you do hear it. And yeah, there's something just so cathartic and indulgent when it happens in this song. Though it's amazing stuff. Speaking of though, the next track on this album is titled "Holy Fucking Shit 40,000." And this one has very peculiar arrangements in terms of its musical palette. You've got these peculiar electronic loops that act as the backing percussion for the acoustic guitar and very echoey lo-fi vocals. And I feel like this is one where that very cheap production for the album works so much in favour of it. It gives the vocals this sort of shoegaze element of being somewhat compressed and distorted, which adds to the to the track itself. It gives us this very weird ghostly effect. I feel it's very interesting. And speaking of as well, the compression seems to even hit the instrumental, especially when you get that drop in towards that really heavy, loud shoegaze riff in the second half and that very long outro of the song. It's all so distorted and confusing, but it works so well in the album's favour instead of expressing this weird sort of disconnect, I feel. And so we move on to the title track of Disc 2, The Future, which is the final instrumental track on this whole album, and it's also the shortest track on both discs we have here. It's got this very weird, peculiar electronic pulse again that drives the whole thing along. It's somewhat similar to There Is No Food, but this one is really dark and foreboding. I feel like you got that pulse driving it along, backed up by this very slow, repetitive beat that pushes it along before you get the guitars and the drones that are just clashing in this really weirdly controlled yet chaotic dirge. And man, it's so ominous though, especially when that that electronic sort of pulse, whatever. I think it's the keyboards. I'm not too sure, to be honest. But it kind of just sounds like this, this heart monitor or an alarm just going off constantly, going off slightly too fast for comfort as well. That makes the pacing very peculiar, and it just makes it all so uncomfortable and existential, And for me, it gives me this sense of complete loneliness and isolation, just looking around for comfort and finding just nothing there to help. And then we move on to Deep Deep, which is another really intense track of bass and motoric drums, whilst the guitars just loudly clang in the background. It's so frenetically paced again, that feels so despairing in its existential explorations in the lyrics again, and it seems to be, to me, the lyrics, sort of looking up the artistic process, the world itself, and existential longing for a mere understanding of why one would feel this way in this incredibly broken, empty world. And for me, I actually really like the religious aspect of this song. You've got him, singing Jesus Christ, why is love so lonely? And I find that to be an interesting aspect of, existentialism, in music, where you explore existentialism through a religious aspect, a religious framework. Sort of looking towards, God or whoever, and asking them, why do I feel this way? Why are things like this? It's something I've explored in a couple of tracks I've written myself, to be fair. Especially coming from that, that Christian background, you've grown up with this, and then, church kind of teaches you though that everything's going to be fine, that you're loved and stuff, and yet if you are, why do you feel so empty and depressed and existential all the time then? And yeah, I feel like it does a very good, and other tracks as well do a very good job of expressing this sentiment of why is it like this then? Why is it? But going back to it though, this is another very intense track though, and it's made all the more so by what sounds like this really peculiar string section in the chorus. I'm pretty sure it's just the keyboards, but it's kind of hard to tell, But it just like stabs though with this really terrifying sound, and it's terrifying to listen to. And it just adds that pacing. It's it's such a terrifying experience within the whole album experience. It's a wonderful way to sort of like, build up towards the end of this thing. Like, phenomenal stuff. And so then we get onto the penultimate track on Deathconsciousness, the incredibly haunting and moving I Don't Love. I have to say, this is perhaps one of the most despairing tracks on the whole album, and it's another existential dirge that looks towards, God for answers of why one is feeling this way. Telling them that they no longer want to live like this or even at all. Man, it's so dark and so moving, and the opening is so sad and miserable. It perfectly leads the way for the explosive shoegazy riff that just fills up the headphones with this phenomenally incredibly loud noise. And oh goodness, it's a phenomenal moment on this album though. And I have to say as well, the outro of this song is genuinely one of the most moving things I've ever heard. And I'll be honest as well, like, if any track on Deathconsciousness is going to move me to tears, then it's going to be this one. The outro is just, screamed and sung out at such a high register with this repetition of I don't love, I don't feel anything, I don't feel anything where this love should be. And as someone who's been there, I'm sure other people have as well. So many people will completely associate with this, You've been there in those completely empty, disassociated states where it's impossible to connect with anyone or anything. And it's such a perfectly stark and bleak expression of such feelings, I'm sure there's so many plenty of people out there who've been swallowed up by their depression and experienced this as well. And weirdly enough, this is where the catharsis comes into play, because there's something really weirdly comforting about experiencing this track and music like this, and knowing that as empty and as despairing as we feel, we're not actually alone in these feelings. Your depression will make you feel like you're alone. It's such a part of it, that isolation. But we're not. In a weird way, we're not though. We are connected by our feelings of existentialism. But man, going back to it though, like, that ending just gets me every single time. It's so bleak, but it's so moving and so beautiful. Like, what a track. And it's there we arrive at the final track. And for those who know, Earth Mover is one of the most fitting ways to end this album. And I would argue it's one of the best songs in Have a Nice Life's discography. This track opens up with this very quiet, airy opener that runs through the first verse, sounding like you're standing at top of the highest mountain looking at the world itself, before you get that really wonderful drop into the song as he sings, they soothe the great machines. And yeah, with that you're thrown into this really loud, phenomenally powerful shoegaze dirge that just needs to be turned up as loud as possible. And man, I don't know why, but this is one of my favourite tracks on the whole of Deathconsciousness, and I just love how loud, how existential it is. There's something weirdly glorious about it as well. It's got a perfect pacing, such a perfect volume of noisy, angry instruments, and then it all just fades away and subsides as you get, you just get this continuation of the vocals, and it's done with this clean guitar tone running throughout the chords. And in the background you've got these very echoey ambient layers, that create this really powerful and emotive ending. And then you get the final lines of the song itself, and the final sung words on the album itself. And it really gets to me though, it's the final words. He just sings, and when the earthen mouths will open up, just what words will come out? But we wish we were dead. And then you get the slightest pause ringing out briefly before That is genuinely one of my favourite moments in any song ever. Like that drop into the perfect loud noisy dirge, leading from existentialism into pure musical catharsis. That fuzzy riff just rings out as for the entire outro of that song, and it's so long as well, but it's so perfect to just let you get lost in the miasma, right? It's so good. And then you get that descending motif on what I think is the keyboard, the pounding drum just pushing it along to the end as the guitars just continue to screech and whine with, static and noise and frequency. It's such a perfect way to end the album, and it just fades out so slowly and so perfectly. It just gives you this wonderful cathartic feeling as you just sit there and you just let it, you just absorb it all, and you just sit with it for as long as you even need to. It's what a perfect way to end this album. I really love this track. And so with that then, we've covered every single song on Deathconsciousness and I Have a Nice Life. And, I feel like there's probably people out there who this album doesn't really emotionally resonate with, which is fine, of course. We're all different. But for me, I find it so easy to see why exactly this album resonates with so many people out there, And browsing through the reviews you get from so many devoted fans on Bandcamp, it just gives us an inkling into the impact this album has had on so many people. It's incredibly bleak and cathartic, it's loud and moving, raw and emotional. And as well, it showcases that you don't need a large budget or an absurd number of, instruments or members to make a moving and emotional album. But just a way to express something real and true, just true emotions. So yeah, so with that then, I think what we're going to do then is, I'm going to go through some of the impact this album has had on people then. And I think the best way to do that is to read out some of my favourite comments from the Bandcamp page from, what people have said about this, because some people have really summed up, like just the existential crisis that you get from listening to this, from their experience, how it connects to this album and stuff, and there's something really beautiful about that. So we're going to go into a couple of them, because you'll see what I mean. Ever since I discovered this album, during my first semester of college, I slowly kept coming back to it. The more I came back, the more I felt attached to the music. It is slowly devouring both not only Connecticut, but my soul in every listen. Do you feel sad? Unmotivated? Restless? Numb? Just straight up depressed? Try this one. It might be the soundtrack you didn't know you needed. By far my favourite album. An absolute masterpiece. I would take this album with me into an underground bunker to ride out the apocalypse in. I lost a friend to suicide last year, and this album has been there for me through it all. I can't thank you enough, Dan and Tim, for creating this and sharing it with the world. Deathconsciousness was and has remained a spiritual experience since my first listen. No album has managed to nail depression like this. It's music that makes you feel comforted in its chaos, a once-in-a-lifetime listen. Up there with the most important existentialist works and one of the few things on this earth that makes living feel okay. The most depressing album ever recorded. Death. The centre topic of everything, the inner conflictive wars with oneself, the desire to get done with life. A classic from our era to be remembered as one of the darkest and saddest musical pieces from our generation. Death has a belt, and he notches it just once, no matter who you are. Our path is one that is taken without question, without thought as to why of it all. The moments we stop to look at life, at ourselves, may be few and far between, but their importance has never seemed to falter. The earth is cold, and we will soon return to its barren soil as the sun descends below the horizon. And as our earthen mouths open up for their final spiteful word, what will they say? We wish we were dead. There's something really powerful and raw from the comments from these people here. But considering the very raw and relatable experience of this album itself, I feel like it's important to mention though that it's not just Dan and Tim experiencing these things, but everyone, and it's a way to bring all these people together. Something so cathartic, something that we can all share with. Despite how lonely and empty and isolated we feel from these emotions. And yeah, hence why I just thought it was important to mention just a couple of things that people have said. It's difficult sometimes, but it's important as well. There's been an incredible and important impact on the lives of so many with this album, and it makes us feel as though we're not all alone with these dark and foreboding thoughts, but instead in the weird existential way connected instead. And for me, I'm really grateful for that though. I'm so deeply moved by this album. But also, after reading the comments from people, I'm really moved by the impact it's had upon people as well. Like, it's really powerful stuff some people have said about this, and it makes a lot of sense, to be fair. So, before we finish up, though, there's a bit more to talk about here. So, alongside special editions of Deathconsciousness, there has also been included a 70-page booklet written by Dan Barrett, going deep into the history of the fictional figure of Antiochus and his followers known as the Antiochians. And it's a very interesting story. Much of the text reads as this historical text that draws upon the most fading glimpses of this non-existent religion. with its non-existence actually being a theme and concept throughout the story as well, you know. It's interesting because it offers us an alternative religion, an alternative to religion, I mean, and an alternative existence by finding this incredible fascination with how and why the human brain can feel and think in this particular way, this fascination with, you know, death and the afterlife. And, you know, to somewhat dive into the life, death and teachings of Antiochus that's mentioned in the story, you know, much of it regards how Antiochus, you know, became a figure for a movement, you know, almost a new religion that seemed to revel in concepts of death as an alternative to existence, death being as important, if not more important, than living. And the Antiochus movement as well, it was small, not gaining many followers, but those who did were very loyal. And, you know, after becoming disfigured by the Romans following his arrest, the Antiochians began to disappear slowly, dwindling down in numbers, until a series of murders began in Rome, mostly the murder of high-ranking Roman officials. And, yeah, the story then goes into, you know, that mentions the capture of one particular murderer, a young 15-year-old activist, who admitted that Antiochus had told him to carry out the murder. And then a wave of arrests of known Antiochians followed. You got interrogations, executions, and those caught by the cult were brutally executed by having their bodies contorted into bizarre shapes before boiling iron was poured down their throat, liquefying their insides. And once finished, frigid water was poured over the body to cool the mixture. And as the flesh slowly rotted or was eaten away, all that were left were these twisted skeletal statues. And Antiochus himself was eventually caught and burned at the stake, you know. And in the text, though, when it goes into that part of the story, it seems like he was all too glad for the fact, you know, he was dead anyway, you know, he was in a state of non-existence within the world. You know, it's very interesting, you know. You know, I find this sort of, you know, fictional story of Antiochus and the whole Deathconsciousness booklet a little bit difficult to really decipher, you know. It's all presented as an alternative form of history, you know, a fictional story, you know, and, you know, a fictional story, an alternative form of history that was erased for whatever reason, you know, which is interesting because it's a fictional mind piece from Dan Barrett himself, though. But it seems to provide, you know, an important context for death consciousness and what it represents on a much larger scale, though. You know, you get this incredibly dark and macabre sense that runs throughout the text, especially with its very graphic depictions of the execution of Antiochians. And man, there's something really existentially horrible about being frozen into a position of death, you know. You know, the text itself, it feels like a narrative exploration of many of the tracks on the album, though. Arguably making it easier to understand the mindset of someone who thinks and feels the way that they do. You know, and provides, you know, it's almost a religious understanding of this alternative way of thinking and feeling, and, you know, one that places such an incredible, you know, weight of importance on existentialism, on the fascination and the fear of death as well, and the struggles of simply existing in a world where these feelings are so prevalent. You know, it's a fascinating read, and it feels so real in how it's actually been presented. Like how Barrett's written this is very peculiar, because it just feels like a genuine piece of historical text that's been lost and obscured. You know, very interesting, and, you know, fans of Have a Nice Life and the album Deathconsciousness definitely give this text a read, though. It'll provide, you know, it doesn't provide actual information, but it sort of gives off the same sense you get from so many of the tracks on this album, though, that sort of existential, you know, despair and confusion and, you know, madness, I guess, you know. And yeah, it's very interesting, though, very interesting, like very peculiar little read. Like, yeah, like I find it interesting that he hasn't actually gone into like much of the process of the album, that instead has just gone into this pure fictional dirge on this very, very, like, you know, very unsettling story. And so with that, I think we've come to the end of today's episode of Weird Music. You know, there's been another very long episode here, but, you know, considering the album in question and 2 discs of music here, I'm hardly surprised. You know, for me, this is easily one of the most important albums I was ever introduced to. It's had such a massive impact, and one that has revealed so much more about itself the more and more I listen to it, though. And it's a perfect expression of, you know, the confusing and terrifying nature of existentialism, feeling so out of touch with the world itself and feeling that only the most darkest and harrowing of emotions. An expression of a fascination with the mystery and the lure of death itself, and, you know, an incredibly cathartic release for anyone who's been there before, I have to say. Truly nothing else like it, you know. Easily one of the best albums ever produced, one of the best lo-fi albums as well. Like, the fact that this costs $1,000 or so is insane, because you can hear it, that's lo-fi, but it sounds brilliant as well. It's so heavy. And yeah, thank you, Dan and Tim. What a phenomenal album you made here. With that though, I would like to thank you for watching this long episode of Weird Music. If you watching right now have any suggestions for future albums that we should look at, then please suggest it in the comments, as I love to check out new music, so I'd love to have the opportunity to do so. For now though, I wish you all the best. I hope you take care, all the best, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.